Welcome to the latest Arabian Business podcast. My name is Eddie Taylor, and I'm delighted to be joined by somebody who every marketer and ad exec needs to read and reread. Gad Saad is a Lebanese-Canadian professor at the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University, Montreal, Canada, and he's one of the foremost proponents of applying evolutionary psychology to the fields of marketing and communication. His 2011 book, The Consuming Instinct, is a brilliant summation of how evolution and human genes provide keys to understanding our choice of products, ideas, and even partners. His most recent book, published last year, The Parasitic Mind, which examines how certain destructive ideas have managed to take hold in places like academia and popular culture. Firstly, thank you very much, Dee, for joining us today, Gad.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Great pleasure to be with you.
I want to kind of begin, if we can, just by giving our audience an introduction to your field of evolutionary psychology and how that might apply to them in their roles, either in marketing, in business, in the boardroom, that kind of thing. Give a quick summation of how you've managed to apply evolutionary psychology to communication and to advertising.
Sure. So first, maybe a very, very quick primer on what evolutionary psychology is, and then how I apply it in various applied fields. So evolutionary psychology is simply the application of evolutionary theory in the same way that we can understand how we have opposable thumbs, how that has evolved. We can apply that lens to study the most important organ in our body, the one that defines our personhood, and it's called our brain. For many people, it's really heretical to argue that human beings are influenced by biological and evolutionary forces. They think that evolution stops at the neck. Sure, you can explain how the pancreas operate using evolution. You can explain why our heart works that way, but don't you dare say that human behavior is shaped by evolutionary forces. So the idea of evolutionary psychology is simply that our brains didn't come out of magic. They didn't come out strictly from culture and socialization and learning. As a matter of fact, those forces exist in their form because of biology. Socialization doesn't exist outside of biology. It exists in its form because of biology. And so I take these principles from evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, and then I argue when we navigate the world wearing our employer hat or our employee hat, or in my case, I spend most of my time applying it to consumer behavior, we don't suddenly cease to be influenced by biological forces. So our hormones affect the types of purchases that we engage in. So I've done studies looking at how conspicuous consumption makes men's testosterone levels rise or drop, precisely because conspicuous consumption is a form of sexual signaling. I've looked at how the ovulatory cycle, women's menstrual cycles, which of course are related to their hormonal fluctuations, will affect the types of foods that they are attracted to, how they dress. And so we don't suddenly lose our biological heritage when we enter the consumatory ring. And so that's what I try to do in my research.
And it's that false kind of dichotomy between nature and nurture. Of course, it can never be one or the other. We are products of the natural world, and therefore we construct our own environments, which then are influenced. How do we construct our environments? Through through what drives us as essentially part of the animal world, right?
Exactly. And a nice way to realize that the nature-nurture dichotomy is really a false one is by this really vivid metaphor. So if you take the ingredients of a cake, there's the eggs, there's the butter, there's the sugar, there's the baking soda, whatever. Each of these ingredients appear to be distinct before we start baking the cake. Now I'm going to make the cake. So now the cake is finished. If I tell you, please point to where the eggs are, please point to where the sugar is, you wouldn't be able to. It's an inextricable mix. So there is no nature versus nurture. Now, it is true that for some phenomena, it'll be a lot more driven by hereditary forces. For other phenomena, it might be a bit more tilted towards socialization. But we are an inextricable mix of both. That's why evolutionary psychologists purport the following idea, that we are an interaction of our genes and our environment.
When did evolutionary psychology enter the boardroom, if you like? When did your area of study, your field of study percolate through to kind of the business world and business decisions?
In the business school, even till today, very, very few people, a growing number of folks, but still a very, very small minority of folks, study things like consumer behavior and advertising and entrepreneurship and personnel psychology and behavioral economics from an evolutionary lens. When I walk into my MBA classes and I tell my students, have you heard the word biology uttered once in any of your courses, and they sort of all scratch their heads wondering, what did they walk into the wrong class? Is this a behavioral biology course? I say, well, how could it be that in a business school we teach people how to be financial traders and economists and employees and employers and consumers, but all of these things happen outside of biology? And so I think a growing number of people are starting to see the value of applying an evolutionary lens, but frankly, too few have. And that's why I'm on this mission.
And we'll get to the ever-fraught world of academia probably a little bit later on in our conversation, because that's the area of your most recent book. But talk to me a little bit about the cultural and academic forces being applied to evolutionary psychology right now. You know, because we live in probably an era where social constructivism is a little bit more in the ascendant, particularly when it comes to things like consumption and marketing and all of that kind of stuff. Where do you think you are right now in terms of your field and its acceptance and sort of the cultural academic currents?
So I guess one way to answer your question is to make the distinction from the onset between practitioners, say, of marketing and academic, marketing professors. Practitioners are actually a lot less hostile to evolutionary reasoning because they are only wedded to what works, right? So if I come and I say, here are some principles from evolutionary theory that we can use to create maximally effective advertising messages, they're not wedded to an ideology that they feel threatened by. Oh, it works. You're going to give me a better way to design better marketing messages. I'm on board. On the other hand, academics are usually vested in a particular paradigm, right? So if I am a social constructivist, and for your viewers and listeners who may not know what social constructivism is, it basically purports that we are born with empty minds with equal potentiality. And the only thing that ends up making us who we become is the unique trajectory of the socialization forces that fill our empty minds, right? Now, on some level, it is true, of course, that socialization matters. But again, as I mentioned earlier, socialization operates because of biology, not instead of biology. So if I were to say which of these two camps is more likely to be hostile to me, by far academics. So I'll give you a great story, which I discussed in the Parasitic Mind briefly. I was invited, I think it was in 2008 when my first book came out, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, came out in 2007. And so I had been invited to the University of Michigan to speak in the psychology department on one day, and then the next day in the business school, both, top rated programs. So when I spoke, exact same talk, there was not much of an overlap in the audiences. And so when I gave the talk in the psychology department, and the talk was about how to apply evolutionary thinking in understanding consumer behavior, everybody was like, yeah, this is fantastic stuff. Love it. Because they were neuroscientists and, biological based psychologists. To them, it didn't seem the least bit surprising that consumers would be shaped by biological forces. Exact same talk the next day at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. I couldn't finish a single sentence, Eddie. I mean, I was basically ducking and weaving as they threw metaphorical tomatoes at me. I probably got through maybe 1/3 of my slides for that day because they were just so hostile to the idea that consumers might be influenced by fundamental biological forces. So to answer your question in a long-winded way, we've come a long way from that incident. There are a lot more professors of marketing that are certainly interested in evolutionary thinking. But again, it should be part and parcel of your education as a marketing scholar to at least know the biological forces that compel us to do what we do.
Oh, I mean, I remember a talk by Heather Haying that was interrupted by a heckler shouting fascist at her because she dared to point out the visible and demonstrable differences between males and females in the animal world. But I guess this is the world we're living in, hence the parasitic mind. I want to begin, though, the wider conversation today, because this book, which I urge everybody to read, The Consuming Instinct, is 10 years old this year. It was published in 2011. And I wanted to look at some of the changes in the consuming and the marketing and the brand and the product landscape in those 10 years, and maybe sort of look at them through your filter and see if you were doing an update, or if you're doing a second edition, or you're doing a new book on the same subject, what are the kind of new contexts that you might have to look at and apply, considering how things might have evolved and changed in the last 10 years. And I guess one of the biggest things that we're now grappling with is environmental consciousness and sustainability. It's such a huge, sort of bearing a huge weight now on people's consumption choices, whether that's reducing consumption or modifying consumption. So I want to kind of get your take on how big a driver this is and how that fits into an evolutionary prism.
Yeah, great question. So one of the places where I can see great applications of what you just said, and that still fits within an evolutionary and biological framework, is something that I speak about, albeit briefly. So if I were to do another edition of this book, I would probably spend more time on it. And that's something called biomimicry. And so I start that section where I kind of tease people, and I often do this in my classes, where I say, who do you think is the greatest inventor of all time? And then people start thinking of, human responses. Oh, it's Alexander Bell, it's Edison, it's whomever, it's Da Vinci. And then I say, no, nature is the greatest inventor, right? Because it has had billions of years to come up with optimal solutions that really work well. Now, these optimal solutions manifest themselves in the way a flower is shaped, in the way an animal's morphology is shaped, and in particular behavioral patterns that offer survival or reproductive advantage to the organism that engages in those behaviors. So keep this in the background for a second. So now what biomimicry does is biomimicry, to mimic, is the idea that if you want to develop new product lines, go to nature, study how nature has solved a particular problem, and then try to synthetically mimic it in your lab. So it's a really cool field at the intersection of consumer behavior, product design, industrial design, biology, ecology, right? So one of the arguments that you could make in a pro-sustainability way is, every time that you cause some eradication of some ecosystem, you end up, extinguishing all sorts of animals and plant life that, had you been able to study them, you might have been able to then mimic those great solutions in the laboratory. And let me give you a concrete example. So, for example, the gecko's feet have these incredible adhesive properties so that it could be stuck on surfaces that are otherwise extraordinarily slippery. Well, material scientists thought, this is interesting. There could be great applications for that. Let us study the atomic structure of the gecko's feet so that we can mimic it. So that would be, if I were writing The Consuming Instinct again, I would spend a lot more time doing this. It's at the intersection of environmentalism, sustainability, biology, new product development. So that would probably be my best answer.
You used in The Consuming Instinct the example of the grass juice. I think that no one's going out and drinking grass juice. But I'm actually wondering in the 10 years since whether a grass juice bar might actually suddenly start to appear on our high street, such as our kind of changing desire for health food and things like that. To what extent do we know how human behavior in a social or a cultural context will actually impact kind of evolution and genes over a certain period of time? I mean, for instance, are we likely to evolve away from our desire for fatty foods, considering we are in abundance, or because of food insecurity around the world, that will always remain a part of our taste structure?
Fantastic question. So so the answer to that would be, if there were recurring selection pressures for enough time for that preference to evolve, or in this case to be eradicated, then it could happen. So that, and you mentioned, can our culture affect evolution? So there is a field called gene culture coevolution, or it's also called dual inheritance modeling, which basically argues that there is an interaction between our genes and our culture in shaping future trajectory of evolutionary pathways. Let me give that might sound like a mouthful, so let me give a concrete example. If you look at the gene for lactose intolerance, so some people can't synthesize say milk well, others can. It turns out that if you look around the globe at the distribution of people's ability to either be able to process lactose or not, it is highly correlated to whether particular cultures have a history of pastoral living, meaning raising of milk producing livestock, whether it be cows or muttons and so on, goats. And so the idea is that as a result of you implementing a cultural tradition, in this case, either pastoral living or not, that creates the selection pressures for either the genes for lactose intolerance or not to evolve. So that's a feedback loop between genes and culture. Through our culture, we can create new selection environments that alter our genes. Now, but you answer, how long could you ask implicitly, how long would that take? So how long it takes for us to evolve away from having 10 fingers, which is now a fixed trait, would take a lot longer than it would take for us to evolve lactose tolerance, right? That might take 5,000 years, whereas many of our morphological features are now fixed, and it would take a hell of a lot longer to now alter these. So how long a particular trait will take to evolve really depends, but it can be as quick as a few thousand years, and you've got to change.
One of the other fields, we'll stay with sustainability and climate consciousness just for now. The other thing is the car. I mean, that's one of the things you mentioned about in the consuming instinct is, that it's the male peacock feather, isn't it? It's the driving the bright red Ferrari or the Maserati, and that is your status symbol. I mean, again, we're probably now shifting towards electric cars, and we're shifting towards, is the Prius the new peacock feather of the automotive world, for instance? Are we getting towards that sort of level now? Are we replacing status signal with virtue signal?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is a paper, not my paper, that I think it's called something like Green to be Seen, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a paper that exactly argues what you just asked, which is, can I use my green consciousness as a new form of peacocking? And the answer is yes. But this, by the way, speaks to a very important point, which is the underlying fundamental driver might be peacocking. The manner by which I instantiate that Darwinian drive might change as a function of the cultural ecosystem, the temporal setting, right? So, for example, seeking status is a fundamental concern for men all around the world, because one of the things that we know from studies on universal mating preferences across very, very different cultures, like cultures that could not be any more different from each other, there are some recurring mating preferences that we see in women expressing in their ideal male mates and vice versa. So in the case of women, one of the things that they care about a lot more than men do is the social status of their prospective mates. So that is the fundamental thing that men go for. But how they go about it varies drastically across cultures. Again, speaking to the culture and genes interaction, right? So in Central Africa, it might be the number of heads of cattle that I own that determines whether I am top dog, so to speak. Whereas how many zeros I have in my bank account and which car I drive, and if I have an Ivy League degree, might matter in the Western context. So the manifestation of the fundamental drive might change, but what is common is that fundamental driver.
Is there a survival instinct kicking in as well? Are we perhaps more conscious of the shared planet that we all inhabit and which we depend on and need is actually under some kind of threat, and that's an evolutionary process kicking in as well as sort of a genetic, I need to look after my neighborhood here?
I mean, if I were to speculate, I would probably say no, because for most people, it's a very fuzzy thing to fight for, reducing carbon emissions. That's why that message doesn't operate well. But if you're able to repackage that message, so for example, Peter Singer, the philosopher who is an animal ethicist, right? He really cares about animal cruelty and so on. What he argues, right? Bring in our animal cousins within our moral circle, right? Now, I would reframe that in a evolutionary language and say, make them our kin, right? If I now sell you the message that chicken, I mean, as difficult as it might be to make that argument, but let's just sort of speculate hypothetically. If I'm able to convince you, which is literally true, that we are all connected in the tree of life, that they are our animal cousins, maybe that kin mechanism, which is a instantiated mechanism in my evolved psychology, then that might make me less likely to be cruel to the chicken, because now I recognize it as my, my family member. That's similar to why I'm able to, I'm more willing to donate to some child in Africa if I start doing pen paling with them, if I quote, adopt them, right? Adopt a panda. So what you're doing is you need to hijack evolved computational systems and then build your persuasion attempt using those neuronal circuitries. Otherwise, if you tell me big, fluffy, highfalutin, save the planet, I don't care, because that's not how my psychology operates. Trigger the right evolutionary impulses, and I might then have a more green outlook.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that most green and evolutionary campaign messages have "for our children and our children's children" in their kind of messaging, as if that's the kin relationship. The other big thing since 2011, which has kind of affected absolutely everything from consumption to the exchange of ideas, that you kind of touched upon in your book, but didn't go into it in any great depth, was social media. And you kind of talked about it as proof of the human desire for interconnectedness and the Dunbar effect and the Dunbar number of the number of people in your family and that kind of stuff. But I wonder whether if you were writing the book now, you'd have a lot more to say about its impact on the exchange of ideas, the consumption of ideas, and also perhaps in the way that brands need to communicate with their audience, because, attention spans and what kind of messaging attracts people, and the repetition and all that kind of stuff. So it's a big question, but social media seems to be the big kind of piece of the consumption pie that you might need to address in a second issue.
I mean, I guess there are several ways to try to incorporate an evolutionary lens within the new reality of social media. So one possible way might be studying how we present ourselves via our social media platforms, right? It's a new modern manifestation of an old set of neuronal circuitries, right? So if in the past I demonstrated that I was top dog by bringing down the big game, then I became top dog by driving the Ferrari. Now I become the top dog by showing myself next to the Ferrari on Instagram, right? So again, the fundamental drivers remain the same, but I'm given new modern day mechanisms by which I can trigger or instantiate that fundamental driver. So probably the first thing I would say, and I actually have done some studies, although they haven't yet been published, where we looked at things like how you would structure a personal ad on social media to get maximal attention or responses. And so let me give you one of these studies that I think your audience would enjoy. And I'm so regretful that we still haven't published these. So maybe our having this conversation will compel me.
I'm loving the scoop. I'm loving the scoop element of what
you're getting the scoop here. That's exactly what magazines and other podcasters love to have. So with one of my former doctoral students, what we decided to do is the following. So we took an image of a guy and we put a descriptor. And so there are two versions of this ad. The only thing that changed across the two descriptors is my favorite possession is, this is part of him saying who he is, right? So that he can get possible dates. And you see either this red Kia, no disrespect to any Kia owners, or it's a red Porsche, if I remember correctly. So nothing else changed in the ad. And so then we asked both men and women to rate this person on a whole bunch of metrics. I'll focus on only one because it's so telling about our evolved psychology and about sex differences in evolved psychology. So one of the traits that we looked at is, can you tell me how tall the guy is? Okay. Now, let me stop here before I give you the scoop, because I want to tell you where I originally had that idea from. So there's a paper, I don't remember the reference, many years ago, probably more than 2 decades ago, where the researchers did the following. They had a guy walk into a room, a classroom, and he was introduced in different experimental conditions as having different ascribed academic status. Here is a postdoc. Here is an assistant professor. Oh, he's a full professor at a whatever. Okay. So the only thing that changed was what status he had as an academic. And then when he would leave the room, they would ask the students who were in the audience, how tall was he? And it turns out that the full professor was a lot taller than the whatever postdoc. And that's why I always joke with my wife, she married a 7-foot basketball player. Because otherwise I'm not doing very well on the actual physical height. I'm like a messy type of height guy. So anyway, so I said, aha, I'm going to take that idea and I'm going to apply it to a consumer setting where I'm going to hopefully show that morphological features change height as a function of the product that the person is associated with. So now here's the scoop. Men, when they viewed the guy in the Porsche, rated him as shorter. Women rated him as taller. So this is called, so we call this the status elongation and status contraction effect. Now, why would that be? Men are threatened by other men who have high social status. Therefore, if I see a guy in a fancy Porsche, then what kicks in my evolved psychology is various derogation strategies. Oh, he must be some little shrimp who is overcompensating for his short height or maybe other lacking qualities. On the other hand, women see the exact same guy. Oh, he's a tall guy, right? Because that's all other things equal. Being taller is viewed as more attractive by women. So the exact same guy is viewed through completely different perceptual lenses by men and women. So that particular study fits perfectly within the context of online personal ads and how I present myself in Instagram and so on. So hopefully that answers your question.
Well, I actually do own a Kia, so I'm going to have to sort of try and do some compensatory work with my wife in the next couple of weeks. What has been interesting about social media is I think most people hoped it would be a tool of unity and of understanding and of cross-cultural understanding. But it seems to have brought out some of the worst excesses in human interaction, and that we resort to the insult and to the personal and to the tribal. Is that a product of where we are in the world generally? We've come out of a massive financial crisis, and we're in a kind of a fairly turbulent and unstable economic time where those thoughts and feelings would naturally manifest themselves anyway. So is social media a reflection of the change in the world where we are right now? Or has it accelerated and exaggerated it? And I saw a fantastic lecture by the historian Neil Ferguson, which he likens now to the discovery of the printing press, in which the dissemination of ideas actually led to, the early examples of fake news and things like that. So is social media a reflection or actually a catalyst?
So, yeah, great question. So the way that I will tackle this question is by introducing the concept of, if you like, ecological validity. Okay, so some things that arise in the modern environment are either consistent with our evolved psychology, or they create environments that are at least violating one, if not several, metrics that typically our evolved brains would have expected. So why am I saying all this? If I look at the number of people who write to me, comment, and so on, they're in the, thousands, millions, okay? 99% of them are super positive. 1% are unbelievably negative. But that 1% is always online, never in person. So I've had, thousands upon thousands of people approach me in the streets and so on. It's always been incredibly kind and sweet. Although I expect that some people might have recognized me and didn't like me, but didn't come up to me. Now, why am I saying all this? Because in the ecologically valid world in which our brains have evolved, there is a consequence to you coming up to me and challenging me in a very aggressive frontal manner, because maybe I'll get angry and I'll retort in a way that you won't like. On the other hand, when you are 6,000 miles away, hiding behind an anonymous account, suddenly you have all the courage in the world and no temperance of your otherwise dark nature, right? Face-to-face interaction causes me to, I don't want to be rude to you face-to-face. you seem taller and bigger than me, and you have a lot of tattoos, not to be stereotypical. You seem to be quite a formidable guy. Maybe I should keep my mouth shut and not tell you that I despise you. But on the other hand, when I'm hiding behind anonymity on Twitter, suddenly I become I become Attila the Hun. So I think the reason why social media brings out the worst in us is simply because there aren't the same cost-benefit calculus that's being kicked in as would be the case in face-to-face interactions. I think it's as simple as that.
I also think there's a playing to the gallery element as well. You know what I mean? Like, you can kind of appeal to your peer group and your community. Hey, I've kind of stuck it to the famous academic, or to the, I've, criticized the soccer player on his, hey, aren't I the big guy? So there's a little bit of socialization going on there as well.
And it's, by the way, and I think you're onto something quite a bit, because I've remarked that most of the times that I get some really nasty person who is not hiding behind an anonymous account so that I can see who they are, it's always, and it's going to sound as though, I'm not trying to be demeaning and so on, but it's always usually someone who appears to be a bit of, I hope I can use that term, a bit of a castrato, but who is trying to ascend the hierarchy. So it's a young guy who's kind of indignant, who's wearing the Che Guevara t-shirt, who wants to go up against, the aging male lion who maybe I can, kick out of the pride so I can take over. So it's always that kind of dynamic. And so there is evolution rearing its ugly head again.
There's a couple of things that we can, I don't know how quickly we can do them, because I know that we're kind of a little bit pushed for time, but there's one thing I want to talk about, and that's manufactured wants. And I think this is the nature and the nurture debate. And I think in the last 10 years, this has come about, or it's manifested itself in the gender divide. So there seems to have been in the last couple of years a little bit of controversy over, why do clothes shops for kids have pink and unicorns and fluffy and tinsel and all that for girls, and it's all construction and soccer and sports for boys, and this is crazy. And I wanted to get your take on the role of manufactured wants. So to what extent is the retailer pushing out products to reinforce gender divide versus they need to shift products, and if they don't listen to their customers, they're going to go out of business. So, where on the needle is the retailer's role in reflecting what the customer wants versus creating an artificial choice?
So not every product necessarily is a instantiation of some fundamental evolved mechanism. You have fads that come up that that are completely useless, that I couldn't tie to a specific adaptive mechanism. But by the way, itself, the fact that we succumb to fads, that itself could be an evolutionary driver, right? So of the two options that you said, it's the latter one, which is that good marketers. So one of the things that I tell my students when, because we get into all the, the fancy science and the evolutionary biology and the cognitive psychology and the rest of it. But then I say, look, if I'm doing a good job in an MBA class, you need to be able to walk away from this course with some clear practical takeaways. So listen up. Here's one practical takeaway I tell them. A good marketer is one that has a very good understanding of human nature, right? So to go back to your example earlier of grass juice, the reason why I gave that example is because our gustatory preferences have not evolved to be attracted to grass juice. So you can put all of the famous stars singing all the jingles in the world. You're not going to get me to be excited about grass juice, but it's not going to be hard to sell me the fatty French fries of McDonald's. Okay. So let's now take an example using your specific context of sex differences and so on. Well, if you look at romance novels, they are almost exclusively consumed, meaning read, by women around the world. There is no culture. It doesn't matter if it's in Dubai or Bolivia or Japan, if it's 800 years ago or 800 years from now. Romance novels are a product that are almost exclusively consumed by one sex, and they're called women. Now, if I want to study the content of that product, one of the things I could study is the archetype of the male protagonist in romance novels. And he's always the same guy. He is tall. He is a prince. He's also a neurosurgeon. He's reckless in his risk-taking. He wrestles alligators on his six-pack, and he could only be tamed by the love of this one good woman. I just explained every romance novel that's ever existed. Now, one company, this is a true story, I don't remember the name of the company, so this is going to speak exactly to your question, decided that they no longer wanted to promote this vision of I don't know if they use the term toxic masculinity. They wanted to create a new vision of a male. So they are manufacturing a want, right? The new male is going to suck his thumb. He's going to cry. He's going to watch Bridget Jones' Diary repeatedly. He's going to be in a fetal position. He's just incredibly sensitive guy. What do you think happened to that romance novel line? It failed because they had the chutzpah, the company, to believe that there is no human nature. I, the great marketer, will impose what your desire will be. I will teach you to like this kind of romance novel. And the consumer said, no, I read romance novels to fantasize about larger than life male heroes. And it's not the guy who's got a logarithmic calculator while watching Bridget Jones' Diary that I fantasize over. So same thing with toy preferences. You could do all the gender parity that you want, but as I explained in the Parasitic Mind, but in other scientific publications, I can show you data across cultures, across time periods, using clinical populations and normal populations, using every possible distinct line of evidence that there is a sex specificity to toy preferences, and no toy manufacturer is ever going to be able to alter that. So to answer your question, hopefully in not a too long-winded way, there are some instances where you could manufacture wants, but if you want to be a good marketer, understand the fundamental human nature and that you're well on your way to being a good marketer.
I mean, every time I listen to the radio, I am convinced of the idea of manufactured wants. I just think if only they played the music that I have in my playlist, then everybody would be converted to good music and we'd have no more problems. But
what is that music, by the way, if I may ask?
Oh, good enough.
I'm sensing you're an Oasis guy.
No, not really. I mean, more Radiohead than Oasis if I had to pick an indie genre. But I'll throw out. So I'll send you some names after the thing, and I'll see if you can pick out any. But I mean, I'm not from a million miles from where Oasis are from, so maybe that's what you're picking up on. Well, that sort of takes us on to the nice segue into the parasitic mind, because the one thing, again, another thing that we've seen in the last 10 years that I think speaks to a lot of what you're talking about in the parasitic mind is corporations as campaigners. And that we've seen now this evolution that consumers seem to want the companies from whom they buy products and services to stand for something more than the product or service that they buy and consume. And I call them corporate Valentine's Days, by the way. So it's a day in the year where a company has to stand up and say, no matter what it does throughout the rest of the year, I believe that I'm going to champion women. And it's on this day, and I'm going to have to do a whole campaign around it. I have to tell you that, yeah, I really believe in women. We elevate women, we celebrate women, we champion women. Earth Day would be another one where we have to, we're conscious about the environment. And then corporate Valentine's Day. It doesn't matter what you do throughout the rest of the year or how you act or what have you. On this one specific day, you have to kind of bombard the market with these messages. And one thing I wanted to ask you about is, A, how sophisticated is the consumer to see straight through that? But equally, to what extent are consumers a bit like an audience in a magic show? They kind of know they're being conned, but they like to be part of the con. They like to be flattered by the con.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on how you deliver that message. I'm speaking from the perspective of the corporation. So one of the distinctions that I make in the parasitic mind when I talk about signaling, whether it be corporate signaling or other forms of signaling, is a distinction, again, that comes from evolutionary theory between costly signaling and virtue signaling, right? So for example, what is costly signaling? So costly signaling comes from the biological principle of, for a signal to be an honest one, it has to be costly to the one that emits it. Because otherwise, everybody could imitate that signal. So for example, when you look at rites of passage around the world, where young boys who want to become accepted as warriors, they have to do this bravery act. It's never do 5 sit-ups, and once you do the 5 sit-ups, congratulations, you're now a warrior. You have to do something that is outrageously scary. You have to be bitten by bullet ants, right? And they're called bullet ants because one bite is akin to being shot, and yet they have to be bitten repeatedly by these bullet ants. You have to stand on top of a platform and jump off with your ankles tied to vine ropes so that just before your head splatters on the pavement, it stops you. Well, it takes a lot of courage to do that. It's going to quickly differentiate between the pretenders, the fakers, the imitators, and the real heroes and the real warriors, right? So a costly signal has to be an honest signal. That's why the peacock's tail is actually a costly signal. Why? Because the peacock could only have evolved that tail precisely because it confers reproductive advantage, not survival advantage. As a matter of fact, it goes against its survivability because it makes it more conspicuous to predators. It makes it more difficult to take flight and avoid predators. And yet, when he opens that big, beautiful peacock's tail, what he is saying to the prospective female mates is, despite this burdensome tail, I'm still standing here. Don't you want to choose me as your, quote, husband? Am I not the right advertisement here? A big neon sign. So now let's apply this to corporations. It's not very difficult to do hashtag Je suis Charlie. It's not very difficult to change my Twitter handle to France when France is attacked from some terrorist attack. It's cheap. It's fake. It's fraudulent. It's virtue signaling. But if I were to speak openly while I live in North Korea, that may be insane and that may be suicidal, but that's a costly signal, right? Because it certainly is an honest signal of my commitment to the cause. So I think if corporations are able to thread that needle so that they can demonstrate that they are global citizens, they care about large issues without appearing as though they are cheap in their wokeism, then I think the consumers will be able to detect that. But most consumers, the kneeling at the knee stuff during the Euros, most people get pissed off at this because they see it as not first, it's a forced action. If I don't do it, I appear to be the player who is racist and doesn't love Black people. But also it appears cheap. Put your money where your mouth is, right? LeBron James is perfectly happy to criticize, the daily genocide that is taking place in the United States, the illusory genocide, but he'll never say anything badly about China because of the NBA's commercial interests with China. So I think consumers are not idiots. They recognize the hypocrisy. So the company who's able to be honest in their commitment for global citizenship is the one that will win in this game.
So that's a great segue into this. You've got one with mirroring. You've got one over your shoulder there as well, the Parasitic Mind. And this basically you tell our audience what's the premise behind it and why did you feel now was the moment to publish it?
Right. So I thank you for bringing this up. So I tell people, and in chapter 1 of the book, I recount the story of, and this might interest the audience in Dubai. I come from Lebanon. I'm Middle Eastern. Arabic is my mother tongue. We were part of the last Lebanese Jews who were in Lebanon when the civil war broke out. And so I saw the horrors of the civil war of Lebanon. So that was the first great war that I faced. The second great war that I faced is the war on reason, on science, on logic, on common sense that was being waged on university campuses. I first began being exposed to it when I was trying to Darwinize the business school, right? That incorporating evolutionary thinking in all of these different business-related disciplines is where I first saw the incredible rejection of science, right? I mean, don't you dare argue about biology. If you study sex differences, you must be some sort of Nazi. So my first exposure to some of these sort of parasitic dogmas came in the pursuit of my science. But then it went much, much further. Then I started seeing things like postmodernism, the rejection of the idea that there is an objective truth, right? We are apparently unable to talk about an objective truth because we are shackled by subjectivity, by relativism, by our personal biases. So postmodernism is a perfect form of intellectual terrorism because it rejects the fundamental principle by which scientists operate, which is they wake up in the morning thinking that there is some natural order to be discovered. Now, scientific truths are provisional. What was true 300 years ago might no longer be true today, but we do operate under the premise that there is an objective truth to be discovered. Another idea pathogen that I discuss in the Parasitic Mind is, social constructivism, the rejection that biology might drive our behavior. Militant feminism is another idea pathogen. Equity feminism makes a lot of sense, the idea that men and women are equal under the law. Militant feminism pushes this idea further. It says, no, we have to actually argue that men and women are indistinguishable in order to defeat the patriarchal sexist status quo. Cultural relativism is another idea pathogen. So there are all of these parasitic ideas that were spawned on university campuses. So in the same way that in today's global pandemic, we're trying to see, where did this virus originate from? Where did it escape from? Well, I can tell you that all of these imbecilic ideas were all spawned on university campuses, but they don't stay in esoteric departments in the humanities and the social sciences. Eventually, they break free from those environments, and then they begin to infiltrate our HR departments and our politics and our soccer Euro tournaments and every nook and cranny. And so what I do in the book is I begin by tracing these parasitic ideas. I explain them, but then, like any good, if you like, physician, in this case, I'm a parasitologist of the human mind, I have to offer a solution, right? If I only tell you, here's the disease, good luck, then that's not really a very compelling, hopeful message. And so in the last two chapters, I offer some vaccination against all of this imbecilic, parasitic stupidity. So that gives you an overview of the book's.
Yeah, and there's an awful lot to agree with. I mean, I think I think most people will recognize, and I've seen interviews with you, and you do concede or acknowledge, maybe concede is the wrong word, but you acknowledge that things like social justice concerns and inclusion and diversity, they actually begin from a noble place, that they're not, it's not a sort of a crazed theory that seeking equality of opportunity is some kind of, that's not some kind of craven left-wing idea that's going to destroy humanity. It's the illogical, radical extent of these ideas. And I think where I would certainly agree with you is like the barely a week goes by when a celebrity is having to apologize for wearing loopy earrings or saying they have a spirit animal or something daft like that. Do you know what I mean? I suppose in your introduction to the book, you kind of presage some of the comments that I might have about the book. So I'm going to throw them out there because you've already got the answers to them. As one, to what extent is this just a passing fad? Is it really a cancerous hold on university departments that will take hold and spread out into every part of culture if we don't arrest it? Or is it just a passing fad that the likes of yourself and the likes of Jordan Peterson and the likes of other people are providing now the kind of the vanguard against it, and there will be a natural swing back? And if we actually look at North American body politics, it doesn't seem to me it's taking hold much beyond academia and culture. That'll be one. So maybe answer that, and then I'll come on to my other point.
Well, so it's not just it's taken a hold of academia, because, for example, we have a prime minister. So he's not in academia, who is a walking manifestation of every parasitic idea that I discuss in the Parasitic Mind, right? And his disordered thinking has real consequences. It's not just some esoteric academic conversation, right? So when, for example, now you have to apply for scientific grants, and the most important thing of that grant is not whether the grant has the chance of curing cancer, but whether you adhere to DIE principles. DIE is the acronym that I've chosen for diversity, inclusion, and equity. So yeah, sure, I have the cure for cancer, but I didn't adhere to the DIE principles on page 1. So sorry, doctor, no grant for you. Now, this is not hyperbolic. This is not facetious. Chaired professorships are granted now, no longer based on the merit of your academic dossier, but on whether you exhibit certain immutable traits.
And this is in all departments. This isn't social sciences and humanities. This is in all departments. This is across the board.
So a lot of my colleagues thought, well, at least there'd be some kind of doorstop at the natural sciences, because surely they won't be parasitized by this stupidity. Well, I can tell you that a physical chemist friend of mine at a sister university in Montreal, a very well-respected physical chemist, who is a, quote, brown person himself and used to be a hardline liberal, was denied a latest grant because he despises all that DIE stuff. So no, it is infiltrating every nook and cranny. I know of students who write to me from, neuroscience labs where, and actually one of the quotes is in the Parasitic Mind, where some student says, hey, Dr. Saad, my supervisor found out that I said something nice about Donald Trump, And now he has taken my name off a paper that I've been working on for a while. It seems like I don't really have a future in this lab anymore. Are you accepting any graduate students? This wasn't in a feminist epistemology. This was in a cognitive psychology / neuroscience group. So no, the capacity for the human brain to be parasitized by stupidity is not restricted to the social sciences. Now, it is true, though, that some disciplines have a greater inoculation against this imbecilic, parasitic stupidity. Why? So in the business school where I'm housed, or in the engineering school, you have less of these ideas proliferating. And the reason for that is because we are coupled to reality. You cannot build bridges as a civil engineer using postmodernist physics. You cannot build econometric models of consumer choice using postmodernist econometrics. Therefore, there is a feedback loop against BS, if I can at least say the acronym. On the other hand, in some disciplines, that you are fully decoupled from reality. You can pontificate all you want, and reality is not there to smack you back into reality. And so while some disciplines have greater inoculation against parasitic ideas, no one is safe. And so to answer your question of, is this just a passing fad or not? The best way I would analogize is sort of the stages in a metastatic cancer. It could be stage 1, it could be stage 2, it could be stage 4, it could go into remission, it could kill you. We are at the stage now where it completely dominates, it meaning all this parasitic stuff, every chokehold of intelligentsia. Of course, academia, journalism, popular culture, now it's in sport. Even the military is being parasitized, right? Every general now has to talk about woke issues and BLM and we're an evil country and so on. So it will get resolved. The question is, how costly will the pushback be? We can resolve it today through our words, through the battle of ideas, or we can resolve it in 50 or 100 years where we will have a repeat of the Lebanon that I escaped from. The choice is yours. That's why people like me and Jordan Peterson keep trying to implore people to participate in the battle of ideas, because there's still time to redress the situation in a peaceful way. And it sounds like I'm being hyperbolic with the violence. People are not going to quietly be told forevermore that they suffer from dermatological original sin, as, for example, we currently have with critical race theory, where 5, 6, 7-year-old children are taught that by virtue of them being white, they suffer from dermatological original sin. White people, some of whom are violent, others who are not yet violent, will one day wake up and say, I've had enough. So let's win the battle today rather than win it violently tomorrow.
Now, I know we have to wrap up, but the one thing I would say again, and you've addressed it in the book, and I'm going to engage in that horrible phrase of whataboutery, that while it's absolutely right to recognize the censoriousness of academia in this particular regard, but pathogens of the mind don't exist solely on the left. They might do in certain elements of academia, but I want to toss a few grenades and saying, surely the QAnon conspiracy theory is a pathogen of the mind. I would even maybe say, I mean, I'm an Arabian Business person here, so I may be a bit contentious here. I would argue trickle-down economics is a pathogen of the mind. That's taken 50 years and it's been debunked repeatedly. We still throw it out there in our business schools and our MBA program. So, I mean, do you at least concede that there are pathogens of equal validity on the right that may be threatening, maybe not academia in the way that you do, but maybe threaten the institutions of democracy if we're undermining the sanctity of elections through the January 6th thing? Is there another side to this?
And actually, I do address that very early in the book, where I say, why do I criticize the left more than I do the right? So let me give two answers. First, I criticize the left more than I do the right, not because I think that the right may not suffer from parasitic ideas. And let me give a concrete example of me admitting that. When it comes to the rejection of evolution, people on the right are much more likely to be the ones who reject it because it goes against my God and my faith and so on. People on the left are more likely to reject evolutionary psychology because it goes against some of the pathogens, social constructivism and militant feminism and so on. So even within my own field of evolution, the rejection of evolution more on the right, the rejection of evolutionary psychology more on the left. So anybody can be parasitized by bad ideas, irrespective of where you reside in the political Even being educated does not inoculate you against parasitic ideas. As a matter of fact, the progenitors, the ones who create these parasitic ideas, are the intellectuals. As I always remind people, and as Orwell reminded us many years ago, it takes intellectuals to come up with some of the dumbest ideas, right? So education will certainly not protect you from imbecilic ideas. But the reason why I focus on the left is because, well, first, I exist in the ecosystem of the left, right? So academia is almost exclusively leftist. I mean, and we're not talking about lopsided. We're talking about ratios of, in some disciplines, of 140 to 1, right? This is not lopsided. It's not 2 to 1, which itself would be a big lopsided. It's 100 to 1, okay? Now, most of intelligentsia is dominated by the left, right? I mean, the right doesn't really have much of a pedestal to shape culture in many meaningful ways. So for people to say, well, why don't you give equal attention to the right would
the
be
the church in America. I'm just going to lob that one in. That's a Sunday morning. Sorry, that's a Sunday morning. That's a fairly big platform. I'll say.
Fair enough. Do we want to see the attendance data on church, on what church attendance?
Well, I'll concede the last 20 years have not been good for the church in America.
Yes, they have been the originators of some parasitic ideas and some nasty behaviors. So you're absolutely right. But again, I'm talking about the key choke points that drive the discourse. It's not the right that has control. It starts with academia and then it spreads to Justin Trudeau's beautiful flowing hair, right? So the bottom line is, imagine that you go to see a dermatologist because you have stage 4 melanoma. And then I come along and say, but hey, doc, why do you spend all your time in melanoma? Why don't you speak against diabetes? Are you saying that diabetes is not a serious endocrinological problem? Why the hate, doc? Why the diabetic phobia, right? Well, because I am a dermatologist and I think that melanoma is a very serious disease. So my focusing on the left is not conceding the point that the right doesn't engage in stupidity, but I live in academia and I need to criticize that which is in front of me, and that's called leftist professors.
That's a wonderful place to leave it. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I learned so much, and I'm sure our listeners and watchers will as well. Thank you so much indeed for joining me today, Gad Saad, and thank you everybody for watching this Arabian Business podcast. Have a good day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.